Good morning. I'm Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our event today entitled Discussing the One-State Reality in Israel-Palestine. Our discussion today marks the publication of a collection of essays published in an edited volume this month by Cornell University Press. In the book entitled The One-State Reality, What is Israel/Palestine? And in a new foreign affairs essay, the book editors Michael Barnett, Nathan Brown, Mark Lynch, and Shibli Telhami argue that a single state already predominates in the territories controlled by Israel. From this starting point, rather than hope for a two-state reality, the book One State Reality offers a reconsideration of the history of and possible solutions to this conflict. Let me take a moment to introduce our speakers who are here with us today, including two of the book's editors and one of the contributors, and a very distinguished speaker who is joining us who did not contribute to the book. The first is Michael Barnett. He is University Professor of International Affairs and Political Science at George Washington University, where his research interests span the Middle East, humanitarianism, global governance, global ethics, and the United Nations. He has written and edited far too many books for me to mention here, the most recent of which is entitled Humanitarianism and Human Rights, Worlds of Differences. A former editor of International Organization, he previously taught at the University of Minnesota, the University of Wisconsin, Macalester College, Wellesley College, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, among many others. We're also joined today by Marwan Mouasher, who is Vice President of Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he oversees research in Washington and Beirut on the Middle East. His very distinguished career has spanned diplomacy, development, civil society, and communications. Marwan served as Jordan's foreign minister from 2002 to 2004 and as its deputy prime minister from 2004 to 2005. He also served in the Jordanian Senate and as senior vice president of external affairs at the World Bank. As a diplomat, Marwan Mouasher achieved a number of firsts. In 1995, he opened Jordan's first embassy in Israel. While ambassador to the United States from 1997 to 2002, he negotiated the first free trade agreement between the United States and an Arab nation. He then returned to Jordan to serve as foreign minister, where he played a central role in developing the Arab Peace Initiative and the Middle East Roadmap. He's the author of several books, including The Arab Center, The Promise of Moderation in 2008, and The Second Arab Awakening, The Battle for Pluralism, which was published in 2014. Our third contributor to the conversation today and to the book itself is Dalia Scheindlin, who is a fellow at Century International based in Tel Aviv. She's a public opinion expert and an international political and strategic consultant, as well as a scholar and a writer. She has advised and conducted research on 8 national campaigns in Israel for more than 20 years, and she provides research and advising for elections, referendums, and civil society campaigns in 15 different countries and regions. Dalia completed her PhD in political science at Tel Aviv University and has previously taught and held positions at a number of universities and research organizations, and she's a very frequent commentator in the international media. Last, but certainly not least, our colleague Shibli Telhami is a non-resident senior fellow with the Center for Middle East Policy in the Foreign Policy program here at Brookings. He is also the Anwar Sadat Professor of Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. Shibli is an expert on US policy in the Middle East, on Arab politics, on shifting political identities in the Arab world. He regularly conducts public opinion polls in the Arab world, Israel, and the United States. Among his many publications are The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East, The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, and the best-selling The Stakes, America and the Middle East. So we have an embarrassment of riches here in terms of deep expertise on Israel and the broader Middle East. A quick reminder to say that we are live and on the record. If viewers would like to submit questions, please do so via email to the email address events@brookings.edu, and we will be addressing questions toward the end of our program today. I'd like to start by welcoming all of my colleagues to turn on their videos and join me here on the virtual stage, and by inviting both Shibli and Michael to say a few words about how the book came to be. This was a project that emerged, I know, from several academic colloquia. But I think in reading both of your reflections, both in the book and in the foreign affairs essay, I have the sense that it came from a strong feeling that this was an issue that needed to be addressed by serious academics and by the wider policy community. I know from my own experience on this issue that more than 30 years ago, when I sought to get a new US passport, I was told that we would no longer need to worry about stamps and passports from Israel when traveling to Arab countries, because this was 1992. There was the expectation that we would have arrived at a full solution to the longstanding conflict within just a year or two. Obviously, many decades and many passports since, the solution to the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians has remained elusive. And the discussion has moved in recent decades into this conversation about the window for the two-state solution. When is it closing? We've been hearing for years that that window may be closing. Shibli, if I can start with you, tell us a bit about how it is that you came to produce this edited volume, the many contributors and their views, and what you hope that will come of this conversation that we're having here today and through the book and the writings.
And thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for hosting this and moderating this. And I should say, I'm just reminded that Michael Barnett is here as one of the co-editors of this volume. I recall that more than 20 years ago, he and I co-edited another book to which you, Suzanne, contributed an important chapter that is still read even today. So it's nice to be joining on the same platform on something related to policy in the Middle East. The conversation started obviously among all of us. First, my colleagues at GW, Mark, Nathan, and Michael were having a conversation about how the discourse around us was so detached from the reality as we understood it as scholars, that it seemed completely detached from what we were observing on the ground. And then Michael came and we had lunch actually at my house to hash this out, to think about a project that would ultimately result in us political scientists grappling with the question, what is Israel-Palestine? Really, we didn't have an answer. We did not conclude right away that it was a one-state reality. Some of us had a hunch, but it was something like that. And then George Washington convened a lot of scholars to come and grapple with this issue, followed by another workshop at the University of Maryland that I hosted, and we invited a lot of superb experts, including Dahlia, to participate and then to contribute chapters. Most of them were political scientists, not all, but most were political scientists, and really grappling with this question of what is Israel-Palestine. But pretty quickly, most of us converged on the idea that it's already one state, and that the discourse around us, the two-state solution discourse, has mostly served as a smokescreen to cover up the reality as it is, and in some ways helped entrench that reality day in and day out, even as the two-state solution, if it had any possibility at all, was diminishing by the day. And that was something that we grappled with very closely. And we have invited scholars to describe what the reality is. We have excellent chapters in the book beyond our own contributions and beyond the article that we publish in Foreign Affairs that deal with the nature of Israeli control of the West Bank and Gaza. Excellent articles by scholars like Yael Berda from the Hebrew University, Diane Greenwald from the City University of New York, who have articulated the nature of that control to lead us to the question that it really is already a one-state reality, that two states, if it's possible at all, we don't dismiss it as a distant possibility because we don't have a solution. We don't think a one-state solution is on the horizon. This is not a one-state solution that we're recognizing. What we're recognizing is a one-state reality, and it's an ugly reality. So once you start with this question about what is it, and you say it's a one-state reality, then you have to ask what kind of one-state. Once you reach that conclusion, it's very hard not to reach out to the label apartheid in the relationship. because you have, once you put on the new glasses and you look at Israel, Palestine, not strictly through the prism of pre-1967 Israel, which was a flawed democracy, and the Palestinians under temporary occupation. Once you look at it as one state, it is impossible to look at the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in that overall state and not reach out for the label apartheid. And that is hard to grapple with. We grapple with that very, very closely in terms of the nature of that state. Once you reach that conclusion, then you have to ask a question about, particularly for us as Americans, about American foreign policy. Are we basically enabling this ugly reality that is both unjust and strategically unstable? And even if we don't offer a solution, we call on our government not to be part of the problem and not to be an enabler of this ugly reality. Now, I want to say one more thing, which I think, there may be a misunderstanding, particularly with regard to our article on foreign affairs, because we don't choose titles. So people usually go by titles. We are not advocating a particular solution. What we're advocating is that we can't accept the ugly reality. And therefore, we must start with the focus on equality, human rights, civil rights. That's what we need to start with. But we also differentiate, and this should be clear, between state and sovereignty. We are not saying that Israel is sovereign over all that territory. We're saying there's a big difference. State is about control. Sovereignty is about international recognition of that control. And international recognition of that control is not going to come even if there is an acceptance of the reality as a state reality in terms of structure, institution, entrenchment, the way it is being handled. And that is not going to absolve Israel or this one state from the international standards, such as, for example, that settlements are a violation of international law. That settlements in those territories that are control over which Israel is not sovereign are still a violation of international law. So it's not an acceptance of the sovereignty of Israel of those territories, it's acceptance of the reality to pass judgment of what kind of reality it is. And that's really important because a lot of people maybe miss that distinction that we need to think about moving forward.
Thank you, Shibli. I think that was a very important point that you made because it was notable to me in reading the preface and understanding the discussions that led to the writing of the book, that what you asked the participants in the workshop, many of whom later contributed chapters to the book, what you asked them to do was to describe the reality, not to offer policy prescriptions. But Michael, as I bring you into the conversation, I wonder if you can help us to understand, if we are simply describing the reality as a one-state solution, that necessarily has implications for both current policy and future policy. And I guess, what would you want readers to take away from this book in terms of what the United States and other governments around the world should be doing in terms of both acknowledging the reality, but also presumably helping to move this situation to a better reality? Apologies, you're muted.
We don't see this one state reality as a solution. It could be a solution to the extent that it enshrines and institutionalizes Jewish supremacy over the land. But that's not a very stable solution or a very just solution. So it could be a temporary solution in the sense that this is where the parties are now. But we don't think it's very stable, and we don't make predictions about where it goes from here. I think we're all too, war-weary veterans of the Israeli-Palestinian issue to think that our predictions would have any kind of beat against the future. But let me just comment a little bit and follow in Shibli's footsteps, I want to emphasize a few things. One, this has been an incredible journey. I think for all of us, not only the editors, but all the contributors, because we were asked to do something, or we asked ourselves to do something that we see all too rarely when it comes to questions of Israeli-Palestinian relations. And that is, let's not begin our analysis with what we hope will be, which in some ways is to invite the utopian, but rather let's begin with what is. And that shift from, if you will, what we wish to what is actually quite revolutionary in the sense that it makes you think about politics, land, people, relations in a very different way. And that was part of our ambition was, as Shibli, used the metaphor, to put on new glasses. And once we take off the old glasses of what we wish and put on the new glasses of the realism of what is, then it really does change the way we look at things. And that was part of our goal. And I would say, I think all of us felt a degree of freedom to, in many ways, dispense with the overhang of the dream of a two-state solution, and instead begin our analysis and our descriptions with what exists on the ground. So the other aspect that we hope we bring to the table is, as we all know, discussions about Israeli-Palestinian politics are often seem to be driven by polemics. There's a lot of grandstanding and flag waving and people getting up on soapboxes. And what we wanted to do was actually, again, try to bring, I guess, a more cool analytic lens to these issues. And to begin by saying, how do we describe it using the analytic tools that we have from political science, from comparative politics and international relations? And will that help us provide more crisp, detailed textures understanding of what's happening? And so what we begin with then is, as Shibli described, is this a one state? And we know that there will be objections to that, but the foreign affairs piece and the longer commentary in the introduction, I think, does a pretty good job of defending why it is that we think of it as a state, which is about control. And let's not get hung up as much, as Shibli noted, on the issue of sovereignty, because we think the state is actually the central creature here. And then also, as Shibli says, that once we say that it is a state, then the obvious follow-up question is, what kind of state is it? And for us, one of the major consequences of that was that it was no longer tenable to argue that Israel is a liberal democratic state. That once you recognize that the state is from the river to the sea, then you begin to realize the extent to which it is a liberal democratic state for some, but not for others. And that leads you then to what amounts to be discrimination institutionalized in terms of relations of superiority and inferiority between Jews and non-Jews. And then you can have a richer conversation about what kind of state is that. Apartheid is the one that has legal and political significance. And so we find it difficult, even if we wanted to in many ways hesitate from the apartheid frame. And as difficult as it was for some of us in the volume to accept that, it was ultimately the one that was the most persuasive. And it seemed to us that actually trying to dodge that issue was disingenuous. What will this change? I think all of us have been in the game for way too long to think that anything we have to say may change anything. All we can hope is that by adopting these new lenses, that we will actually find that people are now forced to actually dispense with their dreams and start from what exists on the ground. And I think doing so has very radical consequences. And so, for instance, I have a chapter there on the Jewish, with Laura Friedman, on the Jewish American community. And one of the implications then is that for Jewish Americans who largely see themselves as holding liberal values, Israel becomes a different kind of state, one that becomes more difficult to support, and therefore demands new sets of conversations in the Jewish American community. So, and I think that those conversations are actually not trivial. I think they're important. So if the book and the essay have any consequences, I hope that it helps to actually trigger a new set of conversations that are less about the two-state solution and more about what really exists.
Thanks so much, Michael. I'd like to now turn to Dalia. Dalia, you've co-authored a chapter with Omar Rahman on Israeli and Palestinian public opinion, and I wondered if you could speak to the extent to which your polling and other survey research has borne out these perceptions that we're hearing from individuals examining Israel from without, that the one-state solution is the most applicable reality that we're facing today. Is that the way that Israelis and Palestinians see it? How has public opinion changed over time among both communities?
Thank you, and thank you to my co-editors who are with us for initiating this project, and to everybody for joining. I think that certainly nobody sees this as nobody is choosing a one-state solution. In fact, one of the biggest findings that we were able to conclude from our we tried to have a fairly exhaustive sweep of public opinion, is that right now we have reached, I'm just giving you the spoiler, skipping to the end, is that the public on both sides, frankly, is despairing of any form of political solution, a situation that we have termed in the chapter post-solutionism. But let me go a little bit back. I think that if you look at the entire region through what we've all agreed is a reality of one state, whether we like it or not, and it is one state in the sense of there is only one recognized state, there is only one entity that has the capacities of statehood and sovereignty, even if it's not declared sovereignty. The other flip side is to realize that Palestinians do not have anything that resembles sovereignty as we know it. So I think that it shouldn't be controversial anymore to see that in this light. But when you put on those glasses, as we've been talking about, and you realize that this is the reality, it actually puts so much of history into place, including the history of public opinion. It makes much more sense when you look at the kinds of questions that have been asked over the years and the kinds of questions that haven't been asked. So one of the things I often love discovering about, when you look at the history of public opinion research, not just the present, is that you learn as much from which questions are being asked as the answers to them. We don't actually have public opinion surveys testing a formal two-state solution, frankly, until really the year 2000 and the early 2000s. Before that, let's say in the late 1980s, mid 1980s through the 1990s, I'm going to take a step backwards, you have each side asking itself what they think about a Palestinian state, because Israel already had a state. Of course, that's indicative as well. Prior to that, neither side even remotely considered such a thing as a two-state solution. In fact, if we're talking about windows, historically, we might really do well to recall that the idea of two states had its own historic window, and it was before the establishment of Israel. It was between 1937 and 1948. It vanished, and it didn't resurface formally, certainly not for Israel, until the year 2000. Remember, the Oslo Accords never even named the solution. So that's the reason, of course, on the Palestinian side, up until, I would say formally, until the PLO declared that it was willing to, that it was striving for a state within the 67 areas. The idea was of one democratic state on all of Palestine, and that lasted through the 1980s. And that's why we don't see that as part of the public discourse. So the first finding is that it wasn't even present in the concept of looking at public opinion for much of the region's history. And then in the 1990s, when support on the Israeli side started at barely 20%, and on the Palestinian side, it wasn't being asked so systematically. We see support rising, each side being asked about whether they support a Palestinian state. And again, only in the 2000s, looking at it as a two-state solution. And at that point, we start to see the opening of a public opinion window during the 2000s, lasting through basically the middle of the previous decade of the 2010s, 2010 to 2020. Only in the middle of that decade. So let's say from the 2000s through about 2013, 14, and 15, we still see a majority or a regular majority, even if not a consistent majority, on both sides who support something that was named as the two-state solution. Not exactly the same data on both sides, but what's been very clear is that from about 2010, the peak has been hit and has been on the decline. And starting from about 3 years ago, the arc has declined to the point where both sides show only a minority, that is below 50%. Certainly among Jewish Israelis, it's even lower because Palestinian citizens of Israel support it at a higher rate. And right now, we haven't seen anything even close to a majority on both sides that support a systematically tracked question about a two-state solution since about 2018-19. And the amazing thing is that the findings just keep getting worse with each survey that we've done, including surveys that have been conducted since we published that chapter, Omar Rahman and myself. And I think that, when you start to realize, when you name the reality, this history of understanding that public opinion itself has only ever been an arc. It took a long time for it to even, the idea of a two-state solution to even be on the map and then reach a majority, but the majority on both sides was limited to roughly a decade between 2000 and 2010. Again, after 2010, you could still find a consistent majority, but not always. And then from the middle of the last decade, that arc is already declining. And right now it looks somewhat insalvageable. I just want to say that I view our chapter in the context of numerous very rich themes that are explored in the book. What you see in our chapter is the psychological dimension, the political psychological dimension, how the two publics conceive of these ideas. I think that it's very helpful in the book that we see this same question approached from an ideological dimension. I'm thinking of Gershon Shafir's chapter on the theology that supports total Jewish dominance, and on the bureaucratic level, you mentioned as well Dr. Yael Berda's chapter on the bureaucratic nature of the one state. And then I think when we think about where this is going, again, from the public opinion perspective, there is no solution that people see. I think the most likely, or the best way to characterize where people are now is the sense that there can be no political resolution to the conflict. And in this one way, I slightly disagree with my colleagues who have said that this is not a sustainable solution. I don't think American policy should support what's going on now because it's immoral and violates international law and it violates the Palestinian right to self-determination. But stable, first of all, it has been sustained since 1967. I think we can quite easily argue that most Israeli governments every Israeli government since 1967 has given its support on some level in different ways to the ongoing occupation. So it is sustainable. We've all been proven wrong, having said it wasn't sustainable for a long time. However, even if it will lead to regular violence, which it will, 100% chance of violence, in the near future, it's very hard to assert with any certainty that alternative political solutions or the processes to get there would not be unstable also. I think we have to take that reality into account anyway. I know that's not very uplifting. To that end, I would say one of the very interesting articles, I just have to name check some of my colleagues because the book is so rich, and I wouldn't want this to be just about our chapter, but I'm the only contributor. Yusuf Munayar has a very interesting chapter, which is, again, not prescriptive so much as it is descriptive of what it would mean to get around the question of what state frameworks we're looking at and decolonizing the actual pillars of the system in place right now. Something that's on my mind as an Israeli. When I hear Palestinians say we want decolonization, there's an actual substantive approach there broken down into the different social, economic, political, legal, moral fields. And I think that's worth thinking about because right now, we don't have any political framework that the public on either side believes in, and no particular political framework that the leadership, certainly in Israel, wants, because they don't want anything that they will name other than full sovereignty, which they have named. between the river and the sea. And on the Palestinian side, I think the leadership simply doesn't have the legitimacy to advance any of the kinds of political solutions that would be good for their people. So I'll stop there.
Dalia, thanks. You've put a lot on the table that I hope to come back to, and I know you have to leave us a few moments early, so I will try to bring you back into the conversation as quickly as I can. But I do want to now turn to Marwan. Marwan, as someone who's been both a scholar and practitioner, I'm going to ask you to speak to the broader issue that we've been discussing here from the perspective of your diplomatic experience, setting up the first Jordanian embassy in Israel, having this kind of key role in the Arab Peace Initiative. Does this acknowledgement and sort of barefaced statement that we are in a one-state reality assist with thinking through solutions to what appears to be a very stymied diplomatic process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, even at a time where the regional diplomacy, and here too, I hope to come back to that, has become much more dynamic and to some extent unpredictable. Does this, sort of acknowledgement here in this book, in this conversation, in a way that happens less frequently in Washington than perhaps it should, that we are facing a one-state reality at this time, does that help or does that impede diplomatic solutions?
Thank you, Susan. I want to first say that I'm talking as an ex-two-staters. I spent all of my time in government trying to affect a two-state solution. With initiatives like the Arab Peace Initiative and the roadmap, which were based on the separation of the two communities so that a two-state solution can be effective. I have changed my views probably around 10 years ago. And the facts are clear, and I think the book, tells them in a very meticulous, scientific, and sustained manner. I think this book is going to be the seminal work on what exists on the ground, even as people, including in the Arab world, will try to reject its findings. I totally agree with everything that has been said, that this is not a solution, but it is a reality. And a reality that can no longer be ignored. Is it going to be helpful? I think so. Because if you keep following a mirage that a two-state solution is still possible, what that has done in 30 years is ignore the rights of Palestinians under occupation. The premise was that we need to worry about the shape of a solution first, and then the rights issue can come later. What I'm arguing now is that we actually should flip the argument. We need to worry about rights first, equal rights for both communities, and then we can worry about the shape, because the shape, it is obvious. And Dalia's polls have shown this very clearly. It is obvious that nobody knows what the shape of the solution is going to look like. But if we don't adopt a rights-based approach as the basis for any settlement, if we don't adopt that, then we will have to deal with, whether sooner or later, apartheid. The taboo word that was taboo a few years ago, but is no longer taboo today. Because the facts are clear. We do have a majority of Palestinians living in areas under Israel's control, whether as Israeli citizens or as, people under occupation. And you are not going to be able to ignore the rights issue for much longer. The book makes a very good argument, saying that Washington must look at Israel as it is, and not as it has been assumed to be. And that's a very, I thought, perceptive remark. We need to look at the situation as it is. Once we do, as Shibli and I think, all of you have said, once we look at the situation as is, then the argument shifts from how do we affect a two-state solution, which I think is impossible today, to what kind of a state should we strive for So that, is it going to be an apartheid state? Is it going to be a democratic state? Is it going to be, what kind of a solution should we strive for if we start focusing on the rights issue? I think this is where we should be heading. Are we heading this way? Not yet. The Arab world is elsewhere. Arab governments have, several Arab governments have signed agreements with Israel, giving the false impression that Israel does not need to come to terms with the Palestinians if they can forge peace with several Arab governments. But it's an illusion that, peace can flourish when the Palestinians fester under occupation. And for countries that do care, actually, including Jordan and Egypt, nobody wants to acknowledge the fact that the two-state solution is over. Why? One, because they don't want to deal with the alternative. The alternative, is very problematic for all of them. Talking about apartheid, talking about a one-state reality is not easy. A lot of Palestinians don't want to acknowledge the alternative because they are worried about what happens to Palestinian national rights, what happens to legalizing settlements, as Shibli said, because there are a lot of misperceptions around this. And other Arab states just don't want to deal with the whole issue. So there is a reluctance today, both in the Arab world and among the international community, to acknowledge what has been obvious to scholars for quite some time now, which is that the possibility of two states, the possibility of separating the two communities is no longer there. And I don't expect that reality is going to be adopted at the official level, but it is certainly today being adopted at the academic level, and it will soon find its way to the political sphere, particularly if the Palestinians themselves start talking with a different discourse. A comment I hear often from European diplomats, from others, Arab diplomats, is that they are not ready to acknowledge that the two-state solution is over if the Palestinian Authority itself does not do that first. But at some point in time, I think people will come to realize the obvious. And that is why I think this book in particular has a very long shelf life. It might not be appreciated by some immediately, but as the situation becomes clear to all, as I believe it is clear to all the authors of the book and to myself as well, as the situation becomes clear, this book is going to be referenced very often.
Thank you, Marwan. I think you've made a number of important points. And again, I want to bring in our other speakers here on several of them. But just recognizing that Dalia will have to leave us in a few moments, I want to perhaps ask you to speak to what has been an extraordinary period within Israel itself. The massive protests on the street, the concerns about the future of Israeli democracy. How does that internal politics, which is not directly motivated by the situation among the Palestinians, how does that intersect with the possibilities for the future of settling the conflict and devising a solution that does produce full and fair political and other rights for all peoples of both territories?
Thank you. And also thank you for being conscious of my time. I apologize to everybody in the audience that I will have to leave at 10 of. It's a very complicated situation. I think that there's no illusions, like from the very beginning of the protests, when Israeli society at large, or let's say Israeli Jewish society, was having its first shocking level of disillusionment about the fragility, or I should say disillusionment with the stability of what it considered to be a liberal democracy, and began flooding the streets. Within the first 2 weeks, it was clear to the protest leaders and organizers, which were very organic, very informal. People came together from many different communities, realized right away, and and advocated for there to be no real conversation about the occupation because they prioritized the great urgency of making the protests as accessible as possible, particularly to those people who had voted for the coalition parties, people who consider themselves to be right-wing supporters of Likud, to be able to join and express themselves and feel comfortable. And the obvious conclusion to for all of the protesters, again, the leadership, to the extent that there is kind of some level of organization, is that bringing the occupation in would destroy that, would ruin it, would be too alienating. And on an anecdotal level, on a personal level, I've naturally been going to all of the protests for 15 weeks now. And whenever you ask people at the protests, or even if you don't ask, they sometimes say, oh, look at those Palestinian flags from those radical activists. I wish they weren't there. What does that have to do with our struggle to preserve the independent judiciary, and which people see as the core of liberal democracy? Now, we're talking about parallel realities, because even among Israeli citizens, we've all noticed, of course, that the Palestinian citizens of Israel have a completely different experience. They never had this image that Israeli democracy was working so robustly over the years for its citizens, because they have been living under, certainly for the first 20 years, under a parallel system that was essentially a form of martial law and a military regime. And since then, under discriminatory practices, which many countries have, but also legislation and a national identity, which is very much structured to alienate them and keep them out of the mainstream. So they have not been as present. But I think that the one counter narrative I can give to that is that many people, everybody who is opposed to occupation among Israeli citizens, Jewish and Arab Palestinian citizens alike, are also part of the protests. They may not be the leadership. They sometimes speak at the protests. Again, I think that Dr. Yael Berda spoke at one of the protests and tried to bring in these connections that seem very intuitive to us, that there cannot be any real struggle to strengthen democracy or build real democracy such as it is without addressing policies that are complete violations of democracy, and the occupation is the biggest example of that. And of course, there are protesters who have certainly been making the case through each week of the protest with signs and banners and trying to get the word out. And many of them, I am among them, I will be very, open disclosure here. Some of us feel that there has been more and more interest and less hostility. If you can imagine, at the beginning of the protest, there was an actual sense of hostility about what are these people doing here and why are they making this statement that the occupation should be part of this, and discussing the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There seems to be less of that. There is lots of interest. We often, notice how many signs and posters we give away. But I think that as a pollster, I have to be very cautious about assuming that represents anything like a widespread trend. I think the best we can say is there is an opportunity, an extraordinary moment in Israeli society in which people are simply asking themselves, what does democracy actually mean? Have we actually had democracy in the full sense of the word in Israel? And for many, including among mainstream Jewish society, they are realizing just how much was missing from the very concept of a constitutional liberal order. And I think that is a moment when there's an opportunity in the long term for people to internalize that democracy means not undermining the self-determination of another people and holding them under separate and unequal forms of rule, one of which is not even civil rule, and also thinking about what that will mean in the future for shifting these policies. But I do think it's not a conversation that is openly happening now. This is the opening of an opportunity to be able to have those conversations, and it will take, at least in the medium term. I think that we're looking at the medium term. We're not looking at some overnight shift. I can tell you that data I've seen recently shows that there has been zero change in the number of people who self-identify as right, center, and left in Israel, even as the electoral map has been shifting dramatically. So there is an opportunity in some, but it will take a long time to realize that. And that means that anybody committed to changing attitudes on this issue within Israel and Palestine need to be very vigilant to continue working on that, even after, I assume, eventually there will be some sort of political resolution over the issue of the judiciary and the current government in Israel.
Thanks, Dalia. I'd like to return to Shibli and put to you a statement that Marwan said, which was essentially we should flip the argument, flip the script of what the prescriptions have been for many years, and worry about equal rights first and about the pathway to separate states, secondly. Does that flipping the script essentially predestine a one-state solution, not just a one-state reality, but a one-state outcome, by further disempowering a Palestinian Authority and other Palestinian institutions which have been so embattled over many years? How is it that one can think about making a better reality for today, especially for Palestinians, even as one does not predetermine outcomes that would essentially disempower those Palestinian institutions? Sorry, Shibli, you're muted.
Sorry. So we take a position in the book and much more in the article in Foreign Affairs that we should base our policy on a rights-based approach. And the reason for it is very simple, that we now do not have a possibility of a solution imminent that the US could advocate. And secondarily, the existing reality is so unjust that it just cannot be tolerated, and we cannot be not only ignore it, but even enabling it through our silence and pretension. So, and actions, in fact, that do kind of reinforce it. So therefore, we do agree that it should be a rights-based approach. However, I do not think that prejudges what the outcome will be. I think if we deal with it in a serious way, it might lead Israelis and Palestinians to contemplate different alternative futures. We don't even rule out a distant future two-state solution. That's not something that looks possible now to us. But in theory, we don't know what will happen in 20, 30 years, particularly if there's a lot of focus on the equality business. And I think if you look at it, there really aren't many possibilities of equality in Israel-Palestine. There are either two states that obviously can be equal and both hopefully democratic, or you can have one state. And that's going to be up to the Israelis and Palestinians to determine the outcome. But it should be clear to the parties, no matter what the outcome is going to be, we're not going to tolerate structural discrimination. Certainly, we're not going to tolerate apartheid. And then it's going to be up to them. I want to say something about that because I think in our political discourse, part of the problem, and by the way, on the American part of this picture, we have good chapters in the book. We ask people to say, how would you consider, what the consequences would be for American policy? We have a chapter by our colleague Kevin Huggard and our former colleague Tamara Wittes, one by our former colleague Khalid El-Gindi, very strong chapter that articulate, consequences for American foreign policy. But particularly in our thinking about this issue, we as co-editors and co-authors of the Foreign Affairs piece, we have seen American foreign policy focus principally on this two-state solution because in a way it solved the problem. The problem was not just sort of something to hold on to for the future, but it also solved a kind of a theoretical problem at home, sort of for Israel to be both a Jewish state and a democratic state. Now, of course, there was always tension between Jewishness and democracy anyway, in the context even of pre-1967 Israel. But if you go to one state, it becomes impossible to reconcile. And you're going to have to deal with that. Are you embracing a democratic Israel? Are you embracing a Jewish Israel? At a time when our public opinion in America is strongly in favor of democracy over Jewishness in the public opinion polls that have been carrying out for years, where even majority of Republicans say, if push came to shove, I would choose a democratic Israel over a Jewish Israel. Certainly, the overwhelming majority of Democrats say that. So politicians would be forced to deal with that. They don't want to deal with that. It's a tough one for them to deal with. And in fact, when we look at the transformation that has taken place in public opinion, as you know, Suzanne, all of public opinion polling I've been doing on this for years have indicated a shift, especially among Democrats, that wants overwhelmingly to have a balanced policy on Israel-Palestine, but increasingly more Democrats want to lean toward the Palestinians than toward Israel. And the most recent Gallup poll, after years of polling by Gallup, found that more Democrats want to sympathize with the Palestinians than with Israel, especially young Democrats. What is the reason for that? The reason for that is that they don't really see it through the strategic prism anymore. And even young evangelicals in my polling show that they don't even see it through the biblical prophecy prism. Increasingly, they're seeing it through social justice prism, one of equality, human rights, citizenship. So that is the prism that is actually animating the non-governmental conversation. And honestly, you know, when we were thinking about this book, is this going to distance us from policy? Many of us, as you know, have been engaged in policy and the policy world. But this was an intellectual exercise. We need to shift the conversation. We need to change the conversation. We need to work with the paradigm. We need to start a broader conversation outside of government. Government officials are not going to be the ones who are going to change their posture. For a lot of reasons, this is not a priority issue for them. They have other issues to grapple with. There's a comfort zone that they want to lean on. They're not in a position individually to create shift in public opinion around them. So it's, as Marwan said, particularly about the Arab world, how this is shifting at the public level, at the intellectual level. And it'll hopefully catch up, at least as the conversation, into official level. But our aim was really to do it certainly among academic scholars and analysts, not so much to address the policy world directly, but indirectly by framing a paradigm that needs to be addressed.
Thanks so much, Shibli. And let me just say a very special thanks to Dahlia Scheindlin from the Century International. Really appreciate your taking the time to be here with us today. And I'm grateful to you for staying, even though you've got another commitment. So thank you, and look forward to many others reading your chapter in this book.
Yes, and thank you all certainly to the host and to Brookings, to you, Suzanne, to my colleagues. And apologies for having to leave early. Bye-bye.
The beauty of Zoom, that we can be many places at one time. So with that transition, let me bring Michael back into the conversation. I know that in the beginning of our discussion today, there was a distinction made between the one state reality as recognizing a reality over state control versus state sovereignty. But I think it's important to think about both, you know, as we flip the conversation from what would it mean for Palestinian institutions. Can you tell me what it would mean for issues like Israeli settlements if we were to, you know, sort of shift US policy to dealing with the current reality? Would that normalize or even legalize Israeli settlements? Would they simply be, you know, sort of normal towns and cities in a one state reality? Or would they still be problematic under international law?
Well, if it's a one-state reality in which Israeli sovereignty, and sovereignty must be conferred. It's not something that a state can claim. It is rather a social recognition. So, for instance, Jordan had control of what became the West Bank, but its sovereignty over that territory was denied by most of the international community, including very vehemently Arab states. So Israel can actually exert control, which it's been doing and will continue to do, but whether that control is recognized and therefore made legitimate is something that can only be done by other states. And I doubt that will happen. So, and it's not enough for, if there's another Trump or Trump himself becomes, you know, gets reelected, it's not enough for the United States to recognize that sovereignty. It must be done by the international community. So as Shibli said, this is not, you know, we should no longer think about the settlements as an obstacle of peace. We should think of it as a violation of international law. And I think that can only be said emphatically. If I could just take the opportunity, though, to follow up on Marwan and Shibli's previous comments, I think there's another reason why people continue to echo that two-state solution. And that is, if you actually abandon it and then you're left adrift, what comes next? And I think the bandwidth of the US government, of European governments and others is actually quite limited, especially at this moment. And so if you were to say it's an apartheid or it's a one-state reality, then the premise is that something must be done. And if you don't know what to do, or you worry it's going to be a distraction from other issues like China and Ukraine, then you stick with the current vernacular. On the rights issue, you know, several years ago, I sort of came to my own internal conclusion that there were Palestinian rights of self-determination, but those aren't the only rights Palestinians have, that the rights exceed just simply the right of, let's say, creating their own state, but also can include the panoply of political, civil, economic, and social rights, which have been denied. The implication, though, is that if in fact the move is to embrace a set of equal rights for those occupied with those who are citizens, the implication is that it will end the Jewish state. And I think that's part of the reason why you see such a hesitation, not only among protesters to embrace the Palestinian situation, but also to go down that road of Palestinian rights, because of the fear that it will erode the fabric of the idea of a Jewish state. So it will have an impact then on what that state currently is. But I think, as Shively says, it opens up the possibility of lots of different conversations that have been put away in a lockbox for several decades. The last point is that I think once we adopt the language of apartheid, that is quite inflammatory language. And I think once Israel becomes understood as an apartheid state, this is no longer simply a situation that must concern the Israelis and Palestinians or key stakeholders, but it's a matter of the international community, and not just simply the community of states, but of human rights organizations, transnational activists, people who are concerned about social justice. Now, I think that will bring a sort of a heavy burden on Israeli politics. But I think the consequence then is about the international climate. And one last point is that, you know, today is very different than 3 decades ago when attempting to dismantle apartheid. That was the beginning of a new democratic wave. We're in an illiberal age at this point. And so I myself am, you know, not bullish on the idea that somehow once you call it apartheid, you'll find the same kind of international mobilization to dismantle it as you did in South Africa 30 years ago.
Thanks, Michael. I do want to come back to some of the points that you just raised, including the language itself and the description, but I do want to bring Marwan back into our conversation and return to the kind of regional dimension, which I think everyone has been highlighting. And there has been, as you noted, Marwan, you know, just sort of a new opening among Israel and a number of its Arab neighbors, the Abraham Accords, and the Negev dialogue. There seems to be a lot of momentum around this, including most recently the possibility that somehow Saudi Arabia might in fact recognize Israel and join in this wider, more explicit alliance among some of Israel and some of its Arab neighbors. How would moving to explicit recognition of this one-state reality impact that? And are any of the Arab states in a position today to apply sufficient pressure to the Israeli government that would produce either a more fulsome recognition of Palestinian rights under the current scenario, or momentum toward a true two-state solution?
Suzanne, the Abrahamic Accords, as they are called, put forward a number of myths that were proved to be false. The first one was that agreement with Arab states is going to help moderate the Israeli position regarding the occupation. That has not happened. Two, that economic cooperation is going to be, the new lay of the land, and that this is going to help Palestinians. Well, the Abrahamic Accords participants cannot even meet. They had to postpone their meeting in Morocco because it is becoming clear that it is a myth to claim that the Abrahamic Accords can flourish, as the book I think says, while the Palestinian issue festers. That's not happening at all. We of course know that the Abrahamic Accords are not about peace. Even the word peace does not appear in many of these agreements. They are bilateral agreements among Arab states, but to expect that you can forge agreements with the Arab world while not coming to terms with people that you occupy is actually, a far stretch. It's, in my view, not going to happen. Now, Arab states are not going to accept that the two-state solution is dead. We already talked about that. But there comes a point when reality on the ground will prevail, in my view. And as Michael said, there comes a point when the international community is going to understand that Israel is applying two separate legal systems, one for its Jewish citizens and one for its Palestinian citizens, and then another separate legal systems, one for the settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and one for the Palestinians under occupation. This is the legal definition of apartheid. It's not the emotional or political definition. This is how apartheid is recognized legally. And I do want to make one point, Suzanne, that Michael mentioned. Yes, most Israelis, if not all Israelis, are afraid that concentrating on rights means the end of the Jewish state. Not necessarily, because there are many scenarios under which a solution can arrive at that preserves the national identity of Palestinians and the national identity of Jewish Israelis. For example, in a federal arrangement, I don't want to count the number of scenarios that have been put forward: a federal arrangement, a binational state, a confederal arrangement. Several alternatives have been suggested in which both communities can exercise their national rights within two entities that are then somehow connected in one way or the other, that is left to the negotiators themselves. But to deny Palestinian rights and use the end of the Jewish state as a reason for indefinitely denying Palestinian rights is not going to fly in this world and age. Michael himself said that the young generation, even the young American generation and the young American Jewish generation, is increasingly seeing this problem through social justice prisms, not through their parents' prism of blindly supporting Israel right or wrong. This is changing, and it will change. I'm afraid that all this is or might not result in any instant change of policy regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict by the United States, by the international community, or by Arab states as well. But change is coming. I'm convinced of this. Change is coming. It might take 5, 10, 15 years, I don't know. And in the interim, we're going to go through a lot of violence. But the status quo is not sustained.
We have a number of questions from the audience, and I'm going to start to weave those into our conversations in just a moment. But I want to put a very brief question to Shibli before I take those audience questions. And that is just an acknowledgement that all of our speakers today have used the word apartheid. And of course, the book and the Foreign Affairs article both use the word apartheid to describe the legal system that exists today within Israel for treatment of its different populations. We all recognize that apartheid was, in fact, a specific system of racial segregation specific to one particular case in South Africa. It may have become something like a more generic description of systematic inequality, much as the sort of generic terms have been adopted, but there are also considerable concerns that the use of this term tends to gloss over significant distinctions between what existed in South Africa and what exists today in Israel, and also that the term itself may be used to demonize and delegitimize the Israeli state. And so, Shibli, if you could just briefly respond to that, do you think that the use of this term is helpful to policy discourse and to solutions? Sorry, Shibli, you're muted.
Let's see. Okay. We thought about this long and hard, the four of us, and also other people who participated in the project. The big shift is not really whether it's apartheid or not. The big shift is whether it's a one-state reality or not. Pre-1967 Israel, even with structural discrimination against Arab citizens, was not an apartheid state. It was a flawed democracy, but not hugely different from other flawed democracy or liberal states around the world. But if you look at the situation of the Palestinians' relationship with Israel in the context of one state, and you think of it as semi-permanent, it's impossible to avoid the label apartheid. And apartheid, by the way, is not South Africa. We actually say it's not. We avoid the comparison to South Africa. Apartheid is actually in international law now. It is basically a term that is encoded and enshrined in international law as a crime against humanity. And while it is based on race, whether it's in South Africa and in international law actually talks about racial discrimination as including people based on religion and national origin and goes beyond race as we understand it in the common language. And so our own conclusion was to basically put aside whether it is, we actually said it is akin to apartheid, but the reality of it is we don't compare it to South Africa. We just talk about it in terms of imposing a supremacy state over a portion of the population. And analytically, I think there's no avoiding that. We can't dodge it. But the switch is not, as I said, it's about apartheid, because that's actually in some ways the easier part. The switch is whether it's a one-state reality or not. And Michael may have some more to say on that, because we have grappled with this issue long and hard.
Yeah, I agree with everything Shibli has said, and I think for all four of us, and I think for many of the people in the project, this was a difficult conversation. There are lots of different opinions on this. I think part of it has to do with what I'm not an international legal scholar, but some of the debates and ambiguities of the legal definition of apartheid. But I want to say something actually, what I think is incredibly important here, which is I would not want the debate over apartheid to distract us from what's really going on. That you can call it apartheid, you can call it Jim Crow, you can call it a caste system. There are any number of terms that exist that from history that provide in some ways not exact parallels, but analogies. Maybe the Israelis will come up with their own organic term for thinking about the systematic discrimination of Jews against non-Jews. But I worry, much like we've seen with debates that go on in other countries about genocide, I would hate for the debate on apartheid to derail what needs to be a more sustained, critical conversation, as Shibley suggested, about what those realities are. And I think the realities, even if they don't add up to you for apartheid, they add up to something quite ugly and certainly discriminatory. And I think that's, for me, the important conclusion.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks to you, Shibley, both for taking that question seriously. I'm going to put a question from the audience to each of you in turn, different questions, and then we will wrap up because we're nearing the end of our time. I'll start with you, Michael. This is a question that came in asking, when did the one-state reality come into existence? The questioner notes that they have heard West Bank Palestinians say they've been living in it since 1967. At what point do the authors of this book see the genesis of the ontological shift that they describe and analyze?
I can only speak for myself. For me, that notion of a one-state reality began to creep into my own vision once I became convinced that there was no two-state solution. And, and so once there were no serious negotiations, once there was no appetite for even thinking about a two-state solution, certainly by Israeli Jews, then it became difficult to avoid that language of a one-state reality. And so I think all of us would have different ways of marking the birth date. I don't imagine that there'll be a consensus. But again, for me, it really was, there is no two-state solution. So now what do we have? And that's when there was no way of avoiding the fact that it was a one-state reality.
Thanks, Michael. Let me put a question to
let me just add one thing I want to say. The interesting thing is the reason why both Michael and I are saying it's really about the one-state reality is because actually Israeli officials and American officials, including John Kerry and previously former President Jimmy Carter, had warned that if you don't have two states and you have this semi-permanent reality, at some point it's going to be an apartheid state. So the leap about apartheid was warned against, foreseen, because once you create the current reality as semi-permanent, that's what you end up with. Now, again, language is important. Obviously, one can debate how you describe it, but it's certainly as bad.
Shibley, while you have the mic, let me put another question to you, and then I'll put the final question to Marwan. Shibley, for you, Shibley, there's a question that came in from the audience asking, on the Palestinian side, even if Fatah could be considered a reliable partner in the process, how would one manage Hamas in a one-state reality?
Yeah, I mean, the reality, it's not about management. That's obviously up for the Israeli state to do. So we have in the book itself, in the article, we don't really address that, but in the book itself, we have a couple of chapters, strong chapters on Palestinian politics. So there are people who have written about it. One of our co-editors also has a contribution on this issue. So it's not really a question about, how you manage it. That's up to the Israelis in many ways in the context of one-state reality. The international community, though, still has an address, which is the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. And people think that it's the Palestinian Authority. Of course it is, because Mahmoud Abbas is the head of both. But in general, I don't think that's going to change in the sense that when you have an address that the international community has to go to deal with, to hear a Palestinian voice officially, I'm not talking about the discourse publicly, officially, they're still going to talk to the recognized representative of the Palestinian people with all its flaws. And the Palestinians are going to have to clean house. So we're not saying the Palestinians have not managed their own affairs badly, or that the Palestinian leaders have managed their affairs badly, or that, in fact, we say the Palestinian divisions have made it increasingly hard. That's one reason why there's no solution on the horizon Same thing with Israeli politics. So we avoid really tackling that in terms of our prescriptions, but we build it into our description.
Thanks so much, Shibli. And this is a finale question to Marwan Muasher from someone in the audience who notes that if you, and I think they were speaking to essentially all the panelists here today, in the generic you, recognize that there is a one-state reality and that this reality is ugly and strategically unstable. Should we not be urging the United States to put its policy where its mouth is, double down on a policy that opens a pathway toward a two-state solution by actively opposing settlements, supporting Palestinian statehood? Fundamentally, if a one-state reality is so objectionable, as I think we have all concluded through this conversation, why not double down on the one path that offers a better solution, a two-state solution?
Suzanne, the answer I have is that the time for a two-state solution demographically and politically has passed by. It's not whether we want a two-state solution. It's not what we hope. It's, as the author said, recognizing the situation as is. Today, there are 750,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including 250,000 in East Jerusalem alone. The ability to separate these two communities, which is the basis for a two-state solution, has gone. That is not to say anything about the political will of the Israeli government, which has repeatedly declared its intention not to withdraw from occupied territory and not to establish a Palestinian state. So that's that's one part of my answer. The other part is we certainly should urge the United States to do a lot of things differently, which have been stated before. Declare that settlements are a violation of international law, not accepting products that come from these settlements. Insist on a rights-based approach that preserves equal rights for everyone. I mean, after all, this is what President Biden said in his address at the beginning of his administration, that he wants a United States that reconciles its values with its interests. And he, explicitly talked about democracy and freedom of speech and all that. So certainly the United States has to do things differently. The problem today is that the United States is elsewhere. The United States is not convinced that the region is of any strategic importance as it used to be. And it has already receded from the region. And I'm afraid something really major security-wise has to happen in the region before the United States might come back. Having said that, Suzanne, I don't want to underestimate the agency that the new generation of Palestinians in particular in the West Bank and Gaza are having. They have lost all trust in their own leadership and in the international community's ability to change things on the ground. What we are seeing today, in my view, is a third intifada. But unlike the first two intifadas, this one is leaderless. This one, is a bunch of young kids who have no hope and who are taking things violently in their own hands. And that's worrisome because it is very difficult to control. There is an argument for the United States to re-engage in the region, but to re-engage differently, not along the old rules. Is it going to do so? I mean, it does not seem to be likely, at least at this stage.
Marwan, thank you for concluding our conversation today on such a thoughtful and profoundly important note. You've given us much food for thought, and I would imagine we could bring this group back together for another conversation. I want to thank Michael Barnett and Dalia Scheinlin, who had to leave a little bit early, and also, of course, Shibli Telhami, our colleague. Shibli, along with Michael, Mark Lynch, and Nathan Brown, are the co-editors of this very important volume. I thank you all for this tremendous conversation and look forward to many more Thank you.
Thank you.